The alarms were screaming before anyone understood why. Captain David Mitchell, hand slipped from the throttle. His head dropped forward. The plane tilted, and for 3 full seconds, nobody in that cockpit breathed. 22-year-old Xavier Brooks stood frozen behind the captain's chair, staring at a wall of blinking lights he had never been allowed to touch. Somewhere behind him, a woman screamed. Somewhere below them, through the storm clouds, a village was drowning and waiting for a rescue that was now falling out of the sky. Xavier had never flown a plane in his life. In the next 58 minutes, he was going to have to land one. But to understand how a cargo loader ended up with his hands on the controls of a twin-engine rescue aircraft, you have to go back 6 hours, to a morning that started like any other, in a life nobody expected to matter. Act 1. Xavier Brooks had spent his whole life around airplanes without ever being allowed to fly one. He was 22 years old, tall, quiet, with the kind of watchful eyes that missed nothing and said even less. He worked at Redline Air Charter, a small regional company that ran cargo runs and the occasional emergency flight out of a cracked asphalt airstrip on the edge of town. His job title was cargo handler. His actual life had been shaped, every single day since he was 6 years old, by the smell of jet fuel and the sound of engines turning over in the early morning fog. His father, Robert Brooks, had worked at that same airstrip for almost 20 years. To everyone who knew him, Robert was the mechanic. The man who could diagnose an engine problem by ear, who kept the fleet of aging planes running long past when they should have been retired, who never raised his voice and never asked for credit. What almost nobody at Redline Air Charter knew was that Robert Brooks had once been a pilot himself. A good one. He'd lost his license years before Xavier was born, after a mechanical failure that wasn't his fault, but that the airline blamed him for anyway, because it was easier than admitting the truth. He never talked about it. He just came back down to the ground and stayed there, fixing the machines he was no longer allowed to fly, and raising a son who watched him do it. Every evening after his shift, Robert would take young Xavier into the hangar, long after the other workers had gone home. He'd sit him in the cockpit of whatever plane was being serviced and walk him through the instruments, one by one, like a bedtime story instead of a lullaby. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, attitude indicator, throttle, flaps. He taught Xavier to read a checklist before Xavier could read a chapter book. He taught him what a stall felt like, what a controlled descent looked like on paper, how to talk to ground control in that clipped, calm cadence that pilots use so that panic never enters the radio. "Why are you teaching me this?" Xavier asked him once, when he was maybe 11 years old. "If I'm never going to be allowed to fly?" His father had looked at him for a long moment before he answered. "Because knowing something and being allowed to do something are two different things, Xavier. One day the world's going to tell you that you're not qualified, that you don't belong in that seat. And on that day, I need you to already know that you do." Robert Brooks died of a stroke when Xavier was 19. He never got to see his son do anything with what he'd taught him. Xavier took the job at Redline Air Charter 3 months later, not because he had a plan, but because it was the only place in the world that still smelled like his father. For 3 years, Xavier loaded cargo. He watched pilots walk past him every single day without a second glance. He watched other young men get flight school scholarships he could never afford, get mentorships he was never offered, get treated like the future of aviation while he stacked crates and fueled engines and kept every single lesson his father ever taught him locked quietly inside his own head. Waiting for what? He didn't know. If you're already invested in Xavier's story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens to him in the next few hours is going to change the way you think about who gets to be a hero. The morning this story really begins, Redline Air Charter's small office was in chaos. A flash flood had torn through Willow Creek, a remote farming community 40 minutes north, cutting off roads and trapping dozens of families on rooftops and high ground with the water still rising. Emergency services were stretched thin. A private rescue flight was being assembled fast, carrying medical supplies, a doctor, and a skeleton crew, because every hour mattered and the county's official helicopters were already committed elsewhere. Captain David Mitchell was the man assigned to fly it. 54 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of pilot who'd flown through worse weather than this and always landed safely. He'd been flying for Redline for over a decade. He was gruff, exacting, impatient with excuses, but every person on that airstrip trusted him completely, because in 10 years he had never once failed to bring a plane home. What none of them knew, what Mitchell himself had been hiding for months, was a heart condition his doctor had warned him about. Arrhythmia. Mitchell had been told, in no uncertain terms, to slow down, to avoid stress, to consider whether flying was still something his body could handle. He'd nodded, thanked the doctor, and gone right back to work, because a man like David Mitchell did not know how to be anything other than a pilot, and he certainly wasn't going to let a diagnosis ground him now, not when people needed rescuing. Dr. Sarah Coleman arrived at the airstrip already in motion, a duffel bag of medical supplies over one shoulder, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice tight, with barely restrained panic. She was 35, sharp-eyed, the kind of doctor who worked fast because she'd learned a long time ago that hesitation costs lives. She had personal reasons for volunteering for this flight that she hadn't told anyone yet. Her younger sister lived in Willow Creek. The last text Sarah had received from her, before the cell towers went down, simply read, "Water's up to the roof. Please hurry." James Turner was the third crew member, 28 years old, a capable flight technician who'd been with Redline for 5 years and considered himself next in line for real advancement. James was sharp, competent, and carried a quiet chip on his shoulder, the belief that he'd been overlooked for opportunities he deserved. He didn't dislike Xavier exactly. He just didn't see him. To James, Xavier was cargo staff, someone who loaded boxes and stayed out of the way. That morning, when Xavier showed up at the gate asking to be added to the crew, James was the first to scoff. "This isn't a joyride, kid," James said, barely looking up from the manifest he was checking. "We need people who know what they're doing up there. Stick to what you know." Xavier didn't argue. He never did. He simply said that Willow Creek needed every set of hands it could get, that he was strong enough to help load and unload supplies fast, and that he wasn't asking for a seat in the cockpit, just a chance to help. Reluctantly, and mostly because they were short-staffed and out of time, Mitchell waved him aboard. Nobody on that plane, not Mitchell, not Sarah, not James, had any idea that the quiet cargo handler climbing aboard with them carried inside his head everything his father had ever known about flying an aircraft. If you're wondering whether Xavier's hidden knowledge is going to matter before this flight is over, trust me, it's about to matter more than any of them could imagine. Drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated by people who had no idea what you were actually capable of? The plane taxied onto the runway just after 9 in the morning, storm clouds already gathering heavy and dark on the northern horizon. Mitchell ran through his pre-flight checklist with practiced calm, his voice steady over the radio to ground control. Sarah sat near the medical supplies, quietly rehearsing in her mind everything she might need to do once they landed. James settled into the co-pilot's seat, confident, alert, ready to prove himself on a mission that actually mattered. Xavier sat near the back with the cargo, his father's voice running through his memory like it always did before takeoff. Altimeter, airspeed, attitude, old habits from a childhood spent in hangars that were never supposed to matter again. As the engines roared to full power and the plane lifted off the ground, climbing into gray skies toward Willow Creek, Captain Mitchell shifted slightly in his seat. He pressed 2 fingers briefly against his chest, just above his heart, and exhaled slowly through his nose. Nobody noticed. He didn't want them to. The mission had begun. None of them yet knew how badly it was about to go wrong, or who was going to be the one to save them. If this story has already pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only the beginning of Xavier's journey, and the hardest part is still ahead. Act 2. The storm hit harder than anyone anticipated. 20 minutes into the flight, the sky that had been gray turned black, and rain began hammering the fuselage in relentless waves. The plane bucked and shuddered through pockets of turbulence violent enough to send loose equipment sliding across the cabin floor. Sarah gripped her seat with white knuckles, glancing anxiously toward the cockpit. James adjusted instruments with quick, tense movements, calling out readings to Mitchell in short, clipped sentences. Xavier braced himself against a cargo strap, watching the captain's hands on the controls with the same quiet focus he'd had as a child in his father's hangar. Mitchell fought the turbulence like a man who'd done it 1,000 times before, correcting course, adjusting altitude, keeping his voice level even as the plane groaned under the strain of the storm. But something was different this time, and it wasn't just the weather. A thin sheen of sweat had broken out across his forehead. His breathing had gone shallow. He blinked hard, twice, like he was trying to clear something from his vision that wouldn't clear. "Captain, you good?" James asked, catching the hesitation in Mitchell's hands on the yoke. "I'm fine," Mitchell said too quickly. "Eyes on your instruments." On the ground, air traffic controller Linda Foster monitored their flight path from a cramped radar station, her voice crackling through static every few minutes with updates on the worsening conditions in Willow Creek. The water level had risen another 2 feet in the last hour. Rescue teams on the ground were overwhelmed. Linda's updates were meant to keep the crew informed. Instead, every transmission ratcheted the tension inside that cockpit another notch higher. "Willow Creek reporting critical water levels." Linda's voice crackled through the radio. "You need to reach the drop zone within the next 30 minutes. Or ground teams say some of these rooftop rescues may not be possible." Sarah's hand tightened around the strap of her medical bag. Her sister was somewhere down there, on a rooftop, in rising water, waiting. She said nothing, but Xavier, seated closest to her, saw the fear tighten every muscle in her face, and for a moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding of what it felt like to be desperate for someone you loved. "You okay?" Xavier asked quietly, leaning toward her over the noise of the engines. Sarah hesitated, then nodded, though her eyes betrayed her. "My sister's down there," she admitted. "I haven't heard from her in almost 2 hours." Xavier didn't offer empty comfort. He simply said, "We're going to get to her." And something about the steadiness in his voice, the total lack of performance in it, made Sarah believe him, even though he had no authority to promise anything at all. James, overhearing the exchange, shot Xavier an irritated glance from the cockpit. "We don't need extra passengers getting emotional back there," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Xavier to hear. "Just stay out of the way." Xavier absorbed the comment the way he'd absorbed 100 comments like it over the past 3 years, without protest, without visible reaction, filing it away in the same quiet place where he kept everything else he wasn't allowed to say. But underneath that stillness, something in him had started to shift. He was tired of being told to stay out of the way while people who needed help were running out of time. If Xavier's quiet strength is resonating with you, hit subscribe now, because the moment where his silence finally breaks is coming, and it's going to be worth every second of the wait. The turbulence eased slightly as they pushed further north, but Mitchell's condition didn't. He gripped the yoke tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched, sweat now visibly soaking through the collar of his uniform shirt. He reached for his coffee thermos, and his hand trembled so badly. He nearly knocked it off the console. "Captain," James said again, sharper this time. "I said I'm fine." Mitchell snapped, then immediately softened, embarrassed by his own harsh tone. "Just tired. Long week. We push through, we get these people out, and then I'll rest." "Copy." James didn't push further, though the uneasy look on his face said he wasn't convinced. Behind them, Xavier watched the exchange with a growing, nameless unease of his own. He didn't know yet what was wrong with Captain Mitchell, but every instinct his father had trained into him was screaming that something wasn't right. 40 minutes into the flight, Linda's voice crackled back over the radio, this time with a note of real urgency. "We're getting reports of a second flood surge upstream. If it hits before you arrive, water levels could rise another 3 to 4 feet in the drop zone. You need to move faster." Mitchell acknowledged the transmission and pushed the throttle forward, increasing speed, fighting to shave minutes off their arrival time. The plane shuddered under the strain, cutting through wind and rain that seemed determined to hold them back. Sarah closed her eyes and murmured something under her breath, not quite a prayer, but close to one. James scanned his instruments obsessively, trying to control the only thing he could control. And then, without warning, Captain David Mitchell made a small, strangled sound in the back of his throat, his hands slipping from the throttle, his body slumping forward against the controls. The plane lurched violently to the right. Alarms exploded across the cockpit, a shrieking, layered chorus of warning tones signaling loss of control, dangerous descent angle, and stall risk all at once. James grabbed for the yoke, shouting the captain's name, trying to wrestle the aircraft back into a level attitude while Mitchell's unconscious weight pressed against the controls, fighting him at every turn. Sarah screamed and lunged toward the cockpit, though there was nothing a doctor could do about an aircraft in the sky except pray it stayed there. Captain, Captain, wake up. James's voice cracked with panic he'd never allowed himself to show before. He pulled at Mitchell's shoulder, trying to shift him off the controls while simultaneously trying to keep the plane from rolling into a spin. The aircraft dropped nearly 200 feet in seconds, the horizon outside the windshield tilting sideways at a sickening angle. In the cabin, cargo broke loose from its restraints, crashing across the floor. Xavier grabbed hold of a fixed strut, bracing himself as the plane bucked violently. And in that moment, staring through the open cockpit door at Mitchell slumped over the controls and James losing the fight to keep the plane level, something inside Xavier went completely still. Not frozen. Still, the way his father used to go still in the seconds before he identified exactly what was wrong with an engine. Every lesson, every checklist, every quiet evening in that hangar rose to the surface of his mind at once. James, level the wings. Don't fight the roll. Ease into it. Xavier shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that startled everyone, including himself. James, mid-panic, barely registered where the instruction had come from. What? The roll. You're overcorrecting. You're going to stall it. Ease off and level the wings first. Xavier was already moving, unbuckling himself and pushing toward the cockpit despite the plane's violent shuddering. Sarah stared at him, stunned. Xavier, what are you? I know planes, Xavier said, and for the first time in 3 years, there was no hesitation in his voice at all. My father taught me. I need you to trust me right now, because we don't have time for anything else. If this moment gave you chills, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Smash that subscribe button, because Xavier is about to reveal exactly how deep his knowledge really goes. Tell me in the comments, at this point in the story, did you already suspect Xavier knew more than he was letting on? James, still gripping the yoke with white-knuckled hands, glanced back at Xavier for a fraction of a second, long enough to see something in the young man's face that hadn't been there a moment ago. Not fear. Focus. The same total, unwavering focus his father used to have bent over an engine at midnight. Ease off the roll, Xavier repeated, sliding into position behind him. Trust the plane. It wants to fly straight. You just gotta stop fighting it. Against every instinct screaming at him to keep pulling, James eased his grip, following Xavier's instruction almost against his own will. The aircraft, no longer being fought in 2 directions at once, began to slowly, shakily level out. The alarms didn't stop, but their pitch changed, the immediate stall warning fading into something less catastrophic. That's it, Xavier breathed. That's it, keep it there. Sarah, still gripping the back of the co-pilot's seat, stared at Mitchell's unconscious body slumped against the controls, then at Xavier, whose hands were now hovering near the instrument panel with a familiarity none of them could explain. How do you know how to do this? She asked, breathless. Xavier didn't answer right away. His eyes were scanning the instruments the way his father had taught him to scan them. Altitude, airspeed, heading, fuel, cataloging the situation with a speed that surprised even him. My father was a pilot, he finally said. Before I was born. He lost his license after an accident that wasn't his fault. He spent every night after that teaching me everything he used to know, because he said the world doesn't always let you prove what you're capable of. But that didn't mean I shouldn't be ready anyway. James stared at him, something shifting behind his eyes, the beginning of an apology he didn't yet know how to say out loud. The radio crackled to life. This is ground control. We're reading erratic altitude changes on your transponder. Please confirm your status. Over. Linda's voice cut through the cabin, tense and urgent. Sarah grabbed the radio before anyone else could. Ground control. This is Dr. Whitfield aboard Redline Rescue 1. Captain Mitchell has collapsed. He's unconscious. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. I repeat, the pilot is down. There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end of the radio before Linda's voice returned, tighter now. All business. Copy that. Redline Rescue 1. Who's currently at the controls? James opened his mouth to answer, then hesitated, glancing at Xavier. My name is Xavier Brooks, Xavier said, taking the radio with a steadiness that surprised everyone in that cockpit, including himself. I don't have a pilot's license, but I know this aircraft, and right now, I'm the one who's going to have to land it. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment to do it. Because everything Xavier has learned his entire life is about to be put to the ultimate test. What would you have done in Xavier's position? Stepped forward or frozen? Let me know below. Act 3. Silence hung in the cockpit for a long moment after Xavier's words crackled through the radio, and on the other end, Linda Foster sat frozen at her station, staring at her monitor as if she'd misheard him. Say again, Redline Rescue 1. Linda finally managed. Confirm, you have no pilot's license, and you are currently controlling that aircraft? That's correct, Xavier replied. His hands steady on the yoke James had reluctantly relinquished to him. Muscle memory guiding his grip even though his heart was hammering against his ribs hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. I need you to talk me through whatever you can. I've studied this before, but I've never actually flown. There was a pause, and then Linda's voice returned, calmer now, deliberately calm. The voice of someone trained to keep pilots steady no matter what was happening in their cockpit. Okay, Xavier. My name is Linda. I'm going to stay on this line with you the entire time. First thing, how's your altitude and heading looking right now? Xavier read off the numbers, and Linda began walking him through basic stabilization, her voice a lifeline crackling through static and rain. Behind him, Sarah had moved to check on Captain Mitchell, pressing 2 fingers to his neck, relief washing over her face when she found a pulse, weak but present. He's alive, she called out. Unconscious, but breathing. I think it's cardiac. We need to get him to a hospital as fast as possible. We're not turning back, Xavier said immediately, and then caught himself, softening. I mean, Willow Creek is closer than any hospital right now, and there's still people down there who need us. But once we land, he gets help first. I promise you that. James, now sitting in the seat beside Xavier instead of the one he'd started the flight in, studied him with an expression that had completely transformed from the dismissiveness of a few hours earlier. You really know how to do this, he said quietly. It wasn't quite a question anymore. My father spent 12 years teaching me, Xavier said, eyes fixed forward on the instruments. Every single evening in that hangar back home, I used to ask him why he bothered, since I was never going to get the chance to actually fly. He told me one day the world would tell me I didn't belong in this seat, and he wanted to make sure that when that day came, I already knew that I did. The words hit James harder than he expected, a quiet echo of every assumption he'd made about Xavier that morning, every dismissive comment, every stick to the cargo, kid. He didn't say anything, but something in his posture shifted, the beginning of respect he hadn't been willing to give freely before. If you're feeling the weight of this moment, imagine living it. This is exactly why you need to be subscribed, because what Xavier is about to face next is the hardest test of his life. Comment below. Do you think James's apology is coming, or does he still have more to prove? Linda's voice returned through the radio, steady but urgent. Xavier, I need you to reduce your speed slightly and begin a gradual descent. We're bringing you toward the drop zone at Willow Creek, but I want you stable before we get there. Talk to me. How are your hands? Shaking, Xavier admitted, because there was no point lying to the one person keeping him alive through a headset. But steady enough. That's all I need to hear, Linda said. Nervous hands that still do the job are exactly what got Mitchell through 30 years of flying. You're doing fine. For a stretch of nearly 10 minutes, the cockpit fell into something resembling controlled tension. Xavier following Linda's careful instructions, adjusting altitude and heading in small, deliberate increments, while Sarah monitored Mitchell vitals and James called out readings from the instrument panel like the co-pilot he'd trained to be, working now not against Xavier, but beside him. Then, almost as if the storm had been waiting for the crew to catch their breath, everything got worse at once. A violent gust slammed into the aircraft's left side, and a warning light flared red across the console. A fuel pressure alert, followed almost immediately by a second alarm indicating a possible mechanical fault in the left engine. The plane shuddered, losing power unevenly, beginning to yaw hard to one side. Left engine's losing power, James called out, panic creeping back into his voice. We're going to lose altitude fast if this keeps up. Xavier's hands tightened on the yoke, every instinct in his body screaming at him to panic, and every lesson his father had ever taught him screaming louder, drowning that panic out. Linda, I've got a fuel pressure warning and possible engine fault on the left side, losing altitude. What do I do? Okay, Xavier, listen to me carefully, Linda said, her voice never wavering even as the tension in the room behind her. visible now in the way other controllers had gathered around her station, thickened. You're going to reduce power on the right engine to compensate for the imbalance, and I need you to trim the aircraft to correct the yaw. Can you find the trim controls? Xavier's eyes scanned the panel, his father's voice rising unbidden in his memory. A specific evening, years ago, sitting in a stripped-down training simulator his father had somehow gotten access to, walking him through exactly this scenario. If you ever lose power on one side, son, you don't panic, you compensate. The plane wants to fly level. You just have to help it remember how. I've got it, Xavier said, his hands moving with a confidence that startled even him. The plane shuddered, fought, and slowly, agonizingly, began to level out again. The yaw correcting as Xavier adjusted the trim exactly as his father had once shown him on a machine that wasn't even real. The engine warning light stayed lit, an ongoing problem that wasn't going away, but the immediate crisis of losing control had passed. Sarah let out a breath she'd been holding, tears streaking down her face that she didn't bother wiping. Away. You did it, she whispered. We're not landed yet, Xavier said, though something like hope had crept into his voice for the first time. But we're still flying. That's a start. This is exactly the kind of moment that separates ordinary stories from unforgettable ones. And if you don't want to miss the ending, subscribe right now. What do you think is waiting for them when they finally reach Willow Creek? Drop your prediction in the comments. Ground Control's voice returned, steadier now that the immediate crisis had passed. Xavier, you're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Willow Creek is 15 minutes out. I need you to maintain this altitude and heading, and we'll start talking through your descent and landing approach as soon as you're closer. How's Captain Mitchell? Sarah checked his pulse again. Still stable, still unconscious. He needs a hospital soon, but he's holding on. Copy that, Linda said. We've got emergency medical standing by at the nearest clearing to Willow Creek. We'll get him transferred the second you're down. James, watching the exchange, finally spoke, his voice quieter than Xavier had ever heard it. Back at the airstrip, when I told you to stick to the cargo, I was wrong about you. I judged you before I ever gave you a chance to show what you actually knew, and that wasn't fair. I'm sorry. Xavier didn't look away from the controls, but something in his shoulders eased slightly at the words. You didn't know, he said simply. Nobody did. That's kind of the point. The plane pushed on through the thinning edge of the storm, the rain finally beginning to ease as they approached Willow Creek, and through gaps in the clouds below, the crew got their first glimpse of the disaster waiting for them. A landscape transformed into a brown, churning lake, rooftops jutting up like small islands, tiny figures visible waving desperately from high ground, some standing on roofs with children held tight against their chests. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, scanning the scattered rooftops for any sign of her sister's house. Panic and hope warring across her face in equal measure. We're almost there, Xavier said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, his father's voice steady in his memory alongside his own growing resolve. We're going to get them out. But as Willow Creek came into full view below them, the true scale of what they were about to face became clear, and so did the fact that landing this plane, with one engine failing and an unconscious captain, was going to be the hardest thing Xavier Brooks had ever done in his life. Subscribe now if you want to see whether Xavier pulls off the impossible, because the climax of this story is coming next, and it's every bit as intense as you're hoping it'll be. Act 4. The clearing Linda had identified for their emergency landing sat just beyond the edge of the flooded valley. A stretch of flat farmland still above the waterline, muddy but solid, with emergency vehicles already visible as small flashing dots in the distance, racing to get into position. Xavier, I need you to listen very carefully now. Linda's voice came through the radio. Every ounce of her attention narrowed to the young man on the other end of the transmission. We're going to walk through this landing step by step. Your left engine is still compromised, so your approach speed and angle need to be precise. Are you ready? Xavier's hands were slick with sweat against the yoke, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears, but his voice, when he answered, came out steady. I'm ready. Behind him, Sarah had strapped herself back into her seat, one hand still resting protectively near Captain Mitchell, who remained unconscious but stable, his breathing shallow yet steady. James sat beside Xavier, calling out instrument readings in a clear, controlled voice, the two of them moving now like a crew that had trained together for years instead of two men who'd been strangers to trust each other just hours before. "Reduce throttle gradually," Linda instructed. "Bring your nose down slowly. You want a controlled descent, not a drop. Watch your airspeed. You don't want to stall this close to the ground." Xavier eased back on the throttle, watching the altimeter tick downward, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to either speed up out of fear or freeze entirely. His father's voice rang through his memory louder than it ever had before, 100 childhood evenings compressed into this single unbearable moment. "Trust the instruments. Trust what you know. The fear is normal. Don't let it fly the plane." The aircraft dropped through the last of the cloud cover, and the clearing came into full view. Smaller than Xavier had hoped, the ground uneven, muddy from the flooding nearby. Emergency vehicles now clearly visible with their lights flashing, tiny figures of paramedics and rescue workers gathered at the tree line, watching the plane's descent with visible tension. "Left engine sputtering," James called out, an edge of fear back in his voice despite his best efforts to control it. "We might lose it completely before we touch down." "Copy," Xavier said, forcing his voice to stay level even as his stomach dropped. "Linda, I've got engine failure risk on approach. What's my play if I lose it completely before landing?" "If that happens," Linda said, her voice tightening for the first time since the crisis began, "you compensate with rudder, keep the nose aligned with the clearing, and you commit to the landing. Going around isn't an option on one engine this close to the ground. You get one shot at this, Xavier. I know you can do it." Sarah reached forward from her seat, gripping James's shoulder, her eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in silent prayer. Through the windshield, the clearing rushed closer, the ground details sharpening. Mud, uneven grass, a scattering of loose debris from the storm that could catch a landing gear wrong and flip the entire aircraft. The left engine sputtered again, louder this time, and then died completely. The plane lurched, dropping several feet in an instant, the remaining engine screaming under sudden uneven strain. Alarms blared. James shouted something Xavier didn't fully register. Sarah's scream tore through the cabin. And in that single, suspended second, Xavier Brooks thought not of his fear, not of the ground rushing up to meet them, but of his father's hands guiding his own over a set of controls in an empty hangar, years and years ago, patient and certain in a way the rest of the world had never been. "You already know that you do." Xavier slammed the right rudder pedal, compensating hard for the sudden asymmetric thrust, pulling the nose level even as the aircraft fought him with every ounce of momentum from the failed engine. The clearing filled the entire windshield now, close enough to see individual paramedics diving out of the way, close enough to see the mud churned up by their own rushing shadow. "Flare!" Linda's voice screamed through the radio. "Now, Xavier, flare now." Xavier pulled back on the yoke in one smooth, controlled motion, exactly the way his father had drilled into him 1,000 times on that old simulator, lifting the nose just enough to slow their descent in the final seconds before impact. The landing gear slammed into the mud hard, bouncing once, the entire aircraft shuddering violently as it skidded across the wet ground, throwing up sheets of mud and grass in every direction. For 3 agonizing seconds, it seemed like the plane might flip, tilting dangerously to one side as it fought against the uneven ground. And then, gradually, impossibly, it slowed and stopped, upright, intact, in the middle of the muddy clearing, engines finally falling silent. Nobody moved for a full second. Then Sarah let out a sob of pure relief, and James threw his head back against his seat, breathing hard, staring at Xavier like he was seeing him for the first time. "You did it," James said, disbelief and awe threading through every word. "You actually did it." Through the windshield, paramedics were already sprinting toward the aircraft, and beyond them, in the distance, rescue boats were pushing out toward the flooded rooftops where survivors were still waiting, the entire operation kicking into motion now that the plane, and the supplies, and the doctor, and the fuel it carried for the rescue helicopters waiting nearby, had finally arrived. If this landing had your heart racing, imagine being the one behind the controls. Hit subscribe if you want to see the emotional payoff of everything Xavier just risked, because what happens next is going to hit you right in the chest. Comment below, what was going through your mind during that landing? The cabin door was wrenched open from outside, and paramedics rushed in, immediately moving toward Captain Mitchell, carefully lifting him from his seat and onto a stretcher, calling out vitals to each other in the clipped shorthand of people trained to save lives under pressure. Sarah jumped down from the plane almost before it had fully stopped moving, scanning the crowd of rescue workers and evacuees being brought in from the flooded area, searching desperately for one face among dozens. "Sarah," a young woman's voice cut through the chaos, and Sarah spun toward it, spotting her sister being helped off a rescue boat at the edge of the clearing, soaked and exhausted but alive, very much alive. Sarah sprinted across the muddy ground and collided with her sister in an embrace so fierce it nearly knocked them both over, both women sobbing, clutching each other like they'd never let go. Xavier stepped down from the plane on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, his hands still trembling from adrenaline, watching the reunion with a lump rising in his throat. James climbed down beside him, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood in the mud, staring at the chaos of rescue and relief unfolding around them. Boats bringing in survivors, paramedics working on Captain Mitchell, families finding each other after hours of not knowing. "I owe you an apology that goes a lot deeper than what I said in the plane," James said quietly, watching the scene alongside him. "I looked at you for 3 years and saw a cargo handler. I never once thought to ask what else you might be." Xavier was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah and her sister still holding on to each other like they were afraid the moment might not be real. "Most people didn't," he said, without bitterness, just a tired kind of honesty. "That's not really on you specifically. That's just how it's always been. Doesn't make it right," James said. "No," Xavier agreed. "It doesn't." A paramedic jogged over to update them. Captain Mitchell was stable, being airlifted to the nearest hospital, his condition serious but survivable, especially given how quickly he'd received care. The doctor treating him had already said the words that would echo through the rest of this story. If that plane had gone down instead of landing safely, if help had arrived even 20 minutes later, Mitchell likely wouldn't have made it. Xavier's landing hadn't just saved the crew and the mission, it had saved his life directly. Xavier absorbed that information slowly, standing in the mud of a field he'd never expected to land a plane in, surrounded by the aftermath of a disaster he'd helped avert, and felt something shift inside him that he didn't yet have words for. Not pride, exactly. Something closer to recognition, the quiet, settling feeling of finally becoming who he'd always secretly believed he could be. This story isn't over yet, and the next part is where everything really comes full circle. Subscribe now so you don't miss it, and tell me, do you think Xavier's story ends with recognition, or does the world still have more lessons in store for him? Act 5. News of what happened at Willow Creek spread fast. By the time the sun began setting that evening, word had reached every corner of Redline Air Charter, and then beyond it. Local news vans parked outside the small airstrip, reporters clamoring for interviews with the young man who had landed a failing aircraft with no formal pilot training, saving not only the crew, but the entire rescue mission that ultimately brought dozens of stranded families to safety. Xavier found all the attention deeply uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone celebrated, and the sudden shift from invisible cargo handler to local hero sat strangely on his shoulders, like a coat that didn't quite fit yet. He answered questions quietly, deflected credit toward Linda's guidance over the radio, toward James's steady hands beside him, toward Sarah's calm under pressure. Anything to avoid standing in the spotlight alone. But some things couldn't be deflected. The airline's regional director, a woman named Patricia Hayes who had flown in the moment she heard what happened, sat down with Xavier personally 2 days later, a folder of paperwork on the table between them. "I looked into your file," Patricia said, studying him with an expression that mixed genuine curiosity with something.